always apart, always asking why when you should be doing what you told. You was never one of us. You never could be.
if you would be so kind, would you mind introducing yourself for the podcast?
Yeah, this is Todd from Like Rats, and I'm in Chicago, Illinois.
And how would you describe the music of Like Rats?
So, Like Rats, despite having a name that we stole from a Godflesh song, doesn't sound a whole lot like Godflesh, unfortunately. And honestly, what we've tried to do with our music is think about the way that extreme metal was in the kind of mid to late 80s, where there were a lot of different sounds that were all sort of under the banner of death metal, some proto black metal bands, thrash metal, etc. But that it wasn't really a codified genre, right? It wasn't like, oh, we're a death metal band, which means that we sound exactly like Suffocation or exactly like Incantation or something like that. And so we've tried to sort of play with the genre as a whole, but we definitely are thinking about a lot of the bands that were releasing material in that kind of late 80s time period, and the bands that influenced them, bands like Celtic Frost or Slayer or Sepultura's earlier material.
Would you place Like Rats music squarely in the metal genre, or would you say you draw from other influences outside of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that our primary influences are mostly metal bands. Other than metal, we certainly will steal a lot of ideas from neoclassical composers as well. So I'm very guilty of listening to Prokofiev piano concertos and being like, oh, I like that little line right there, and I'll just steal it for a Like Rats riff. So there's a lot of very directly stolen material like that. But in terms of the overall structure of the songs and things, as far as composition and aesthetics, etc., we're basically trying to imitate Morbid Angel and Slayer and Sepultura and Celtic Frost.
So I definitely want to talk to you about your songwriting process and, expand on the idea of taking influence from neoclassical. I think most of the people listening to this podcast will know some of the other bands that the members of Like Rats have been in, such as Weekend Nachos, which I think kind of operated in more of a hardcore slash grindcore slash power violence space. Would you say that you guys come from more of a hardcore background?
Yeah, so I think that in Chicago, where a lot of us grew up and met each other, we've all been involved in a similar music scene that kind of let's say is centered around a lot of hardcore bands. Some metal bands are kind of adjacent to it, but the sort of suburban Chicago music scene and the Chicago music scene that most of us grew up in were mostly made up of bands that were influenced by a lot of hardcore bands or metalcore bands, or kind of that sort of weird technical screamo stuff that was all the rage in the early 2000s. So I think most of us have a background in that type of scene, and Weekend Nachos was definitely an outgrowth of that. Although I do think that at least for me, I was always kind of the guy who liked metal, who was at the hardcore shows, because that was sort of like where my friends were, if that makes sense.
It's funny because I was your mirror image. I was the metal kid with the long hair and the death metal shirt who went to hardcore shows every week or every other week or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never really seen a big separation between the genres. I think a lot of it comes down to fashion choices, you know what I mean? And it's easy for people to say, oh, you wear these kind of shoes, so you're a hardcore kid, or, you have this kind of hair, so you're a metalhead. I don't know if people really pay attention to the music so much that they know that they can say specifically, oh, this comes from a hardcore band, this comes from a metal band or whatever.
Yeah, totally. I think that it's really interesting if you kind of look at the history of those genres, which are sort of cousins, right? Where, in the early 80s, there probably was a lot more separation between hardcore and metal, where, hardcore was very directly related to the punk movement, and then metal had a lot of high vocals and guitar solos, Judas Priest and Iron Maiden and such. And then it kind of got all smashed together with a lot of thrash metal bands and some of the hardcore bands at the time as well. Bands like Discharge or Battalion of Saints or The Exploited, a lot of that stuff was very influential on what would become extreme metal. So it all got kind of smashed together in the 80s. And then I think it started to separate again, right? That metal sort of went down one path, and then hardcore kind of became this weird thing that took a lot of the aesthetics of metal, but sort of refined it into some let's say, simpler song structures with more focus on certain like types of tension and release, and it's sort of characterized by, mosh parts and people spin kicking and all that kind of stuff. And then metal sort of went more in a lot of different directions. So it kind of all smashed together and then sort of splintered apart again. But I think that there's that sort of like weird cousin relationship between the genres, and things that at one point would have been very metal, like a chug part, right? Like that's not in hardcore bands in the early 80s for the most part. But now that's sort of a characteristically hardcore thing to do, is to have, galloping palm muting parts that people can mosh to.
Yeah, I mean, for anybody who wants to call those hardcore parts or whatever, I mean, go back and listen to a Minor Threat song from the early 80s. You don't have any of those kind of parts, but you'll find them in Anthrax, you'll find them in Slayer, you'll even find them in Sabbath and Judas Priest.
Totally.
So let's talk about the history of Like Rats a little bit and give listeners some background on the band. How did the band come together?
So we're talking about 10 years ago, so this is a little bit difficult to remember exactly, but at that time, a bunch of the guys who were in Like Rats had been in a pop punk band that had been touring pretty regularly. They were nearly a full-time touring band, and that band broke up. And so, as it happens in a lot of scenes, right, you get a bunch of people who kind of will play songs together and sort of bounce ideas off of each other and form different bands. And it's like, okay, you have these 10 people, and then if you sort of swap the members around, you can get 15 different bands out of that group of individuals. And pretty much that exact thing was happening in Chicago at the time. And so based upon that, we had actually written some songs previously that we did some demos of that were much more kind of black metal, right? It was very much like just a bedroom black metal type of project that we never really did anything with. And that was myself and Andy and Dan. And Andy plays bass in Like Rats, and Dan used to drum for Like Rats and now does vocals. But we had done those songs and never really did anything with it. And then, through some conversations, we decided to actually turn that stuff into a real project. And that was how we started writing songs for the first Like Rats demo, which came out in 2009.
Now, why specifically the type of music that you pursued? Why originally bedroom black metal and now this kind of pan metal, extreme metal kind of sound?
So I would say that there hasn't necessarily been as much, direct thought as like, okay, well, I want to be in a band that sounds exactly like this. I mean, almost to a fault. I think that we've potentially caused some trouble for ourselves by not embracing sort of standard genre conventions, and I think that can create some confusion about what we're doing. But I mean, my favorite band is Celtic Frost, and it has been for a really long time. And Celtic Frost has sort of been the one consistent, strong influence on Like Rats. And I just always wanted to write riffs sort of the way that Tom Warrior does, where they're very chromatic. They kind of move around in a very interesting way, where they'll sort of be, multiple building blocks of different note choices kind of stacked on top of each other. And I just always wanted to write songs that sounded like that. And he also has a pretty impressive sense of rhythm that doesn't necessarily come across in like a technical way, but there's implied rhythms in a lot of the riffs. And then there's also very clear punishing rhythms in something like, let's say, Procreation of the Wicked. And I just always loved all of those pieces. And so that's pretty much always what we've been trying to do with Like Rats. And whether or not that sort of was in a more, black metal style or a more death metal style, that's always been the underpinnings of what's going on. And the actual kind of like aesthetics on top of that, I think, are a little bit less interesting. But that sort of ends up being, for us, it's more just been kind of the direction that the songs have gone in, and we sort of tried to at least make them sound cohesive on top of that, right? But I think that the underlying structure has always been very much in that same vein of like, okay, this is the way that Tom Warrior thinks about music and the way that he thinks about riff writing, and we're just going to try to do something similar.
Tell me what you mean by implied rhythms.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a pretty universal concept in a lot of extreme metal, right? You have something that's based upon a lot of, let's say, tremolo picking, or in the case of more punkish sounding stuff, like kind of always has that same D beat, or in a lot of black metal, it's that, sort of like half blast going on. And so the rhythm is pretty steady, right? It's just kind of this steady abrasive thing that's either a blast beat or a tremolo pick or whatever. But the way that the actual notes shift within that kind of implies a rhythm. So the overall aesthetic is just kind of like an entire block of sound that doesn't necessarily have like a clear, chunky rhythm. But if you're paying attention to the changes, it's like, oh, okay. Like there's actual timing as to when these notes change that implies a rhythmic structure that isn't necessarily obvious if you're just kind of like listening to the wall of noise. I don't know if that made any sense.
I think I'm following you. I'm curious though. I do play guitar and write songs a little bit, so I think I know what you're talking about. So tell me about your songwriting process. You mentioned pulling from neoclassic influences.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, with a lot of songwriting, there's a few different ways that ideas will kind of come to fruition, right? And one of them is just kind of the sort of lightning bolt from the gods, like struck with some fantastic idea. And that happens sometimes. Occasionally you're just kind of going about your business and some riff will just materialize in your brain and you're like, oh man, this is really important. And you try to record it somewhere or figure it out and keep track of it. Those tend to be some of the more exciting moments. Another layer for us, I mean, as I mentioned, we're not shy about what our influences are. So, I have lists and lists of songs that I like and riffs that I like that I want to potentially steal in the future. So, you can kind of go through those lists and sort of think about, okay, well, I like this specific incantation riff. Why do I like it? Let's figure it out. Let's figure out what the structure is. Okay, that's kind of interesting. Now let's see if we can potentially take that concept and rebuild it in a different way. So that's the sort of like stealing way. And then there's the other way of just kind of fiddling around, right? Usually a song will be built for us based upon one of those ideas, either something that kind of just materializes or something that we're sort of specifically trying to steal. And once you have a few different ideas, you're just trying to connect them. And then in that context, more of like a jamming type of thing can work out, right? And, we're not necessarily a band that gets together and just kind of like jams it out. But if you are just kind of messing around, you're like, okay, I need to get from this idea. Let's say I have some sort of tremolo pick part that goes like, on this part of the neck. All right. And I know I need to get down here for this other part that has a slightly different feel. How am I going to connect those? And you can just try a bunch of different stuff and kind of feel it out. So I think those are the three main ways that songs will actually come to pass. And it's just kind of trying to force the creative juices to flow. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't.
Yes, face it down, where I live.
On April 10th, you released the third Like Rats album. Tell me about the writing and creation of Death Monolith.
I think we started actually writing songs for Death Monolith probably in 2017. And that was after our second record had come out in 2016. And very similarly to what I was just talking about, we had a few different ideas. We were kind of piecing a few different things together. We didn't really jump right back into songwriting, but once we started getting going with it, it kind of became clear the direction that the record was heading, right? Which was, as we discussed before, a little bit more of like a death metal type of sound. And so based upon that, I was like, okay, this is very much the direction this record is going. So that gave a little bit of focus in terms of what the other songs should sound like. So, we had a few kind of like cornerstone songs of the record. We had a few things that we started early that ended up not really working out properly, and we kind of recombined some of those ideas into songs that did end up being on the record, just in a totally different form than how they started. But yeah, I mean, it is very much a process of getting a few major ideas, and then once you have a few ideas of what's going on, you kind of have an idea of, okay, well, we should have a sort of flow to the record as well. So, maybe we need another song that's kind of longer and has a more complex structure. And then, all right, we have that song written now, so let's maybe come up with something that's a little bit more like fast and to the point, and you're able to sort of lay out the entire record the same way that you might think about laying out a song based upon that.
You mentioned the cornerstone songs for the record. Which would you say those are?
Yeah, so I think that the first song on the record is one that we had written relatively early in the writing process. That song is called World Devourer. And that sort of set the tone for, I think, a lot of what we were actually going to try to do. And then actually based upon that song, we rewrote some of the other ones where it's like, okay, this is the direction that we're going. So let's try to actually build around that. So I think that song was really probably the first song that we wrote for the record that I consider to be fully formed. And then, I'm trying to remember the actual order that we wrote things in, but I think that Crimson Cosmos was another one where it's like, okay, this is, a kind of longer song, very much influenced by, Beneath the Remains era Sepultura in terms of song structure and things like that. So that's kind of another direction that we can sort of go in. So I think that's probably a few of the things that sort of set the tone for what we were going to do and helped us figure out the direction that we're trying to go in.
How would you compare Death Monolith to the previous Like Rats album?
Yeah, I think that in previous records we were sort of trying to not embrace some of the death metal conventions that we had on Death Monolith, right? We were trying not to use a bunch of double bass. We were trying not to use a lot of tremolo picking. We were trying to write songs without those sort of genre conventions to kind of see what would happen. And I think that a lot of that actually just became kind of like limiting, right? It was like, okay, the songs are trying to go in this direction. The parts that we're writing are trying to go in this direction. Like, why are we trying to not utilize these sort of tricks that people utilize within the genre that we're playing, and we just really kind of gave up on some of that stuff and just embraced it. So I think that's a potential pretty big difference there. And I certainly think that, like I said, we had a few songs that sort of gave a clear direction for the record that I don't necessarily think that we necessarily had on previous albums, where it's like, oh, okay, I sort of see what we're doing now, and we're going to fully embrace that and go for it. So I think that's probably one of the biggest differences.
When you say that this album embraces a lot of the genre conventions of death metal, from my standpoint, it sounds like Death Monolith has a more overt traditional, or let's say like Florida style death metal influence than the previous albums.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think that Morbid Angel is a huge influence on the band. And I think Morbid Angel has always been something that we've enjoyed and lifted ideas from. I can certainly point to several different riffs on our first record and our second record that are pretty much carbon copies of certain things on those first two or three Morbid Angel albums. But, there's a lot of stuff that Morbid Angel does that I think is, well worth emulating. So we certainly are not shy about saying like, yeah, there's definitely some Florida influence on there. And I would say that Dan, our vocalist, would definitely consider David Vincent to be an influence as well, especially the singing parts or the talking parts on what's the last song on God of Emptiness. Bow to me faithfully part. Loves that part.
Nice. So this album was recorded by your bassist Andy at his studio, Bricktop Recording. Has Andy recorded all your music up to this point?
He has, yeah. I mean, if you have someone like Andy in the band who's, a world-class recording engineer for heavy and extreme music, you got to just be like, all right, cool, Andy, what do you want to do? Great, let's do it. So yeah, it's been a huge blessing to have Andy able to just kind of, take what we're doing throughout band practice. I'm sure he's thinking about how he wants the record to sound once we're actually putting it together, and then just go into the studio and sort of say, all right, we're here to play the songs, and you know what you want us to do, and let's make it happen.
But that can go either way, right? When you have a sound engineer in the band, because on one hand, you can do the pre-production and the recording much quicker, because that's, internally you have somebody who that's their field of expertise. But does it also mean that there's a lot of perfectionism and getting things right becomes a little bit more of a personal task?
Yeah, I would say that perfectionism hasn't been a huge problem for Like Rats. I've definitely seen bands where that can be a huge issue, right? Where, someone gets neurotic about something, or is kind of freaking out about trying to nail something, or is hearing things that aren't really there. I think with Like Rats, across the board, we have a pretty good balance of saying, okay, we're going to hold ourselves to a very high standard, and we want this to sound a certain way, and we want to get a certain quality of performance. But, we're not going to freak out over like minor issues or minor performance problems or whatever. It's like, okay, like this sounds good and this sounds right, and we're ready to move on. And I do think that there, like you said, there can be other issues where if someone in the band is the recording engineer and there is like a conflict in terms of the creative vision of like, oh, I want it to sound like this, or I want it to sound like that, and the person who's kind of, manning the controls has a different vision, that could potentially get ugly. But I guess we're fortunate in that Andy has an idea of what he wants to happen with the music, and I think that everyone is pretty much in agreement with his vision for the sound, if that makes sense.
So you talked about some of the influences and stylistic development of the band from a songwriting perspective. In terms of the production, was there a specific sound that you guys were going for?
I'm kind of a production ignoramus. I'm really not someone who pays a ton of attention to the actual production of records. Again, almost to a fault where, I don't necessarily really know too much about like, oh, okay, well, this is this kind of sound, or this is this kind of amp, or I definitely want the guitars to have this tone, or like this production sounds too modern, or this production sounds too necro, or whatever. Like I the way I listen to music is much more focused on the actual song structure and like what the riffs are doing, almost to the exclusion of other stuff. So I just look at production as something that could either be like a problem where it's distracting from what I pay attention to, but not necessarily something that's as much part of the actual creation or the experience of it. But I know that that's not the way that most people pay attention to things. So I'm happy to just kind of like, again, turn that over and be like, you know what? You have an idea of what you want this to sound like totally, let's do it. So I wish I could think of some of the references that Andy actually was using for the record, but I don't know any off the top of my head. I do think at one point that we talked about Sepultura Arise as being a potential, sound comparison, but I don't know if Andy would actually agree with that. So take that for what it's worth.
So tell me about the record label that is releasing Death Monolith. Who is Hibernation, and how did they get involved with this?
Yeah, so Death Monolith is being put out by Hibernation Release, and Hibernation is run by Cameron, who the guys from Weekend Nachos knew him because he actually worked with Relapse at one point, and Relapse put out a bunch of Weekend Nachos releases. So they had a good relationship with Cameron, and once we actually had, some of the demos put together for Death Monolith and had an idea of when we would potentially be recording the record, we just started to reach out to people and said, hey, listen, like, would you be interested in putting this out? We're looking at recording it sometime whenever. And, sent that out to a few people, and Cameron was very stoked on it and wanted to do it. And the guys who knew him from the Nachos days had nothing but good things to say about him. And I was like, all right, cool. Like, this seems like a very good fit. So let's do a vinyl record and a few cassettes.
So is Hibernation handling mostly the physical release, or are they also handling the digital side?
Yeah, so they're doing both. And I'm not totally sure how the digital stuff works, because I think that Cameron licenses the digital stuff to another organization that, like, puts it up on YouTube and Spotify and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not totally in the know on all the details of that stuff.
nearing the end of the podcast, and this is usually the point where, I ask bands to talk about their plans for the future. Obviously, with everything that's going on with the COVID-19 virus and the pandemic, most people's plans are up in the air. We talked about our respective situations, mine in Malaysia, yours in Chicago, before the interview started. Maybe, if you don't mind, just talk about the situation over there and how it's affecting the band.
We're recording this just for frame of reference in the middle of April, and Chicago has been on a shelter-in-place order since the end of March. I think our shelter-in-place order went into effect on the 21st of March. And yeah, I mean, that obviously, coinciding with a record release and all that wasn't fantastic for our live music plans. Our record release show was supposed to be last weekend with Spectral Voice and Crips and Horrendous. And I was actually really excited about that show. I think that those bands are all good. And I was like, man, this is going to be fun to play with them. But yeah, that was obviously canceled. And we had a short tour planned with Disrotted in the summer that is also canceled. So, we were like, okay, well, what are we going to do? So I actually just started playing a few of the songs on Instagram. I just plugged in the guitar and the practice amp and just played along with a few of the songs from the record and posted those on Instagram. It's like, hey, here's our record release show. Thanks for coming out. And I'll probably do a few more of those just for, fun. It was actually kind of enjoyable. I was like, you know what, this is a sort of a fun thing to do and people seem to enjoy it. So I'll probably do a few more of those this weekend. So I guess that's going to be our live music, contribution during COVID-19. Yeah. I mean, I'm really not sure what the prospects look like for live music. Something that I do think could be interesting is I think it's going to be potentially a while before we see touring come back, but that might actually be a good opportunity for local bands to kind of play together and actually have people show up, right? Because that's something that a lot of people in bands experience where you're like, people in our own city don't necessarily care that much about coming to see us because, we're like, it's like, oh yeah, who cares? We've already seen them a bunch of times. We know they're going to play again, whatever. But when we play other places, like people are much more excited about it. And I actually think that there's potentially a good opportunity for local music scenes as restrictions are loosened and things start to happen again to like have all local shows that actually have people come to them and to potentially build a stronger local scene, which is something I think Chicago struggles with. So if there were to be a sort of silver lining to, COVID-19's impact on the music business, it might be that there's a bigger opportunity for local musicians and local shows to actually have attendance and to like build a more cohesive community. And I'm curious to see if my predictions are correct, but we'll kind of keep an ear out for when that type of activity is going to be allowed again. And I would really like to shoot to get some all Chicago death metal shows going.
The new Like Rats album is out now. It's called Death Monolith, and you can get it through Hibernation Releases. Todd, tell people how they can order the album, what the best way to order the album would be.
Yeah, totally. So it's up on Hibernation Releases Bandcamp. So it's hibernation-release.bandcamp.com. Although I think the first pressing is actually pretty close to being sold out right now. So it might actually, the first pressing might be just about gone. I think I have an email in my inbox that I just opened that I need to respond to about whether or not we're going to do a second press. So we'll hit a response on that, and there may be a second pressing coming soon. But it's also on all the major streaming platforms, so people can listen to it on Spotify or Apple Music or YouTube or what was that? What was that thing? Audio Scrobbler? Is that even a thing anymore? I don't know.
I'm actually behind the curve on most streaming services. I use Bandcamp fairly regularly, but everything else I'm a little bit behind on. But you mentioned pressing, so I understand that there's a couple different physical options, like a colored vinyl version.
Yeah, there's two colored versions. The rare one, I don't remember the names on these. They have cool names though. Some sort of like Cosmos Splatter or something like that. That one's been sold out for a little while, but there I think there are still a few at the time of this recording left of the other colored vinyl. But again, I'm pretty sure those are close to being gone. And there's cassettes too.
As far as following Like Rats, how can people do that? How can people find you guys online?
Like I said before, we just got an Instagram recently. We were kind of trying to not participate in social media, but gave up on that and figured it was worth it to promote the record properly. So our Instagram handle is like.rats.shy. CHI as in Chicago. So people can follow us there. And then, like I said before, our music is on all the streaming platforms, so people can find us wherever they so choose.
And if people want to get in touch or follow what you do, how can they do that?
I have a podcast that I do that occasionally involves interviewing musicians, but usually not. It's usually more people involved in various academic pursuits that I find interesting. Some social psychologists, economists, etc. Some fitness coaches who I think have something interesting going on. And that's at toddnief.com. That's I before E. So TODDNIEF.com. I have a newsletter there that I send out every week with the stuff that I've put together. So podcasts, articles, whatever, and anything I found interesting. So I always have some articles and things like that I've enjoyed, as well as a song that I send out. And I think most of the people who follow that are more in like the fitness space and things like that. So I'm just, sending them weird death metal songs, or I think I was going to send out some African pygmy music this week. I'm like, yeah, this is going to be funny. The click-through rate on that link is going to be low, but for the people who click through, they're going to have a great time.
So it's rare that I get to speak with, let alone interview another podcaster. Tell me about the podcast a little bit more. Why did you choose to start a podcast? Well, what's the name of the podcast, first of all?
Yeah, it's just called Todd Nief Show. So very, very simple, straightforward name. And, I'd been doing some podcasts that were more focused on the fitness space, right? I mean, both for the gym and for the online coaching that we do for more like competitive CrossFit athletes. And at some point, I don't think I realized that most people aren't interested in just like anything and everything, that they don't necessarily care about, complexity science and music and, the ins and outs of different business strategies and programming software and all those kinds of things. I thought everyone just kind of liked all stuff, but I learned that that's not necessarily the case. And I was like, oh, okay. I'm sort of different. I'm a freak, and I should just put all the weird stuff that I want to talk about in its own thing. So I did that in 2017. I just kind of was like, okay, I'm just going to have my own podcast where I can talk to whoever I want, and there's no presumption of it being a fitness thing. And so that's why I started doing that. And it's been, super interesting just to be able to, honestly, to reach out to people and be like, hey, do you want to be on my podcast where I can ask you probing questions about your ideas that would be awkward in a normal social situation? And that's a good opportunity for me to do that.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, because you're describing the podcast as being in the fitness space, but this isn't like a bro science jock talk kind of podcast. It's an extremely analytical, and I would say even philosophical kind of podcast where you guys really dig deep into big ideas and really, I mean, I wouldn't exactly describe myself as an intellectual, and so a lot of what I heard was losing me. But it's a very, I would say, very smart, very thoughtful podcast.
Yeah, I in a past life, I thought I wanted to be involved in academia, and I started to take some steps towards that and realized it wasn't necessarily for me. And then I've actually recently been involved with some rationality meetups in Chicago. I started going to those a little less than a year ago, and it sort of like reawakened an interest in me where I was like, you know what, I actually really like a lot of ideas and reading research papers and things like that. So I've been trying to get back into some of that stuff. And again, the podcast is a good opportunity to do that. And a lot of academics will actually be happy to talk about their research paper that they thought no one was going to read. So if you're like, hey, I read your paper and I think it's interesting, they'll be happy to talk about it. So that's been sort of a fruitful avenue for me.
And how can people subscribe to your podcast?
It's on all the normal podcast places. I use Overcast. It's by far the best podcast player. So if you're not using Overcast, you're screwing up. But yeah, it's called Todd Nief Show. And again, I put out an episode every other week. So I'm on a 2-week cycle with that. Yeah, I think the most recent one that we put out is with my friend Ian Kaplan, who's a chiropractor, and he's super interested in the quality of evidence and statistical reasoning and all kinds of super sexy topics like that. But we kind of go deep on how to actually decide whether a treatment is worthwhile. And we also just sort of like roast the shit out of the chiropractic profession, because he has a pretty bad attitude towards most chiropractors, but a really interesting attitude towards pain science and like what actually works for people and things like that. So that's the type of discussion that happens on those pods.
Very cool. Do you want to talk about your other band, Hate Force, a little bit?
Yeah, sure. You want me to just go for it, or do you have a specific question?
No, just any updates on what you may be working on?
Yeah, totally. So Hate Force is another band that I'm in, and that's with Drew, who plays drums in Like Rats, and like you said before, played in Weekend Nachos. And then James, who sings for Harm's Way, is also in Hate Force. So we put out a record, was that last year? I think that was last year. Yeah, last year on Closed Casket. That was cool. It was fun. It actually sold pretty well. So that's always good when you can, at least feel like you're helping the people who put out your record, make their money back and not lose money on you. I mean, Hate Force is a side project, right? That James is touring. Well, not anymore. Was touring full time with Harm's Way. Yeah, I mean, Hate Force is actually primarily Drew's project, I would say, right? Drew has written the majority of the songs for that band, and James and I each contribute as well. But Hate Force is more of like a kind of like a, I don't know, let's say primitive death metal band. And we have been writing new songs for another LP. And I think we made some pretty good progress in the writing there. So we had maybe 5 or 6 songs pretty close to done for that before the shelter in place orders went into effect. So, hopefully Drew's been using his sheltering for creative purposes and has a few more ideas for us. I know I had a few riffs that I put together, but didn't actually turn into a song. So yeah, I mean, hopefully we'll be able to finish up writing for that and get another Hate Force record out into the world sometime in the next year or two. We'll see.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom.